All right, so now we've talked about Thomas Paine a little bit. I want to talk about George Washington. And, I think it's interesting that while he is the most celebrated, legendary figure of the American War for Independence, of the American Revolution, um, right now, how many of you know anything about him? I mean, it's interesting because he's probably the most celebrated and also neglected historical figure, at least now. That wasn't the case in the past. Um, I remember even though I had a student when I first taught US History 101, a student told me, I never realized that he didn't seem to do that much. And I was also realizing that my lecture didn't even highlight as many things coming dealing with George Washington. And in part because what we really see is that he is a successful soldier in battle. And as I mentioned to you, my lectures don't really focus on war history, which is, I'm not saying that's important. That's not important. Each historian kind of chooses to highlight what they want to in a junior college setting when it comes to those kind of things. I certainly did mention him, but I've realized that if you actually cut out, him actually creating the success of the campaigns, he kind of then moves into a symbol of a symbol, even as a president. But of course, there is more to him than that, and I think that he is a very interesting character. And so I thought, well, I want to make sure that I don't have you walk away with such little knowledge of him. But I would say this though. It's not totally unjustified in the sense that in the past, what you really had was a lot of discussion of George Washington that was literally 100% purely made up into completely made up stories. So, for example, the chopping of the cherry tree and telling his father that he could not lie. This was an American author who wanted to sell books and create a mythic character. And, people loved it. There were these stories of him, having these great prayers out on the battlefield. He takes on mystical properties over time. Different places throughout America claim that he's, George Washington stayed here. I mean, we're everywhere. You have all sorts of things to where George Washington ends up looming very large, especially in the earlier decades and centuries of the United States. And I think as those myths fell away, the lackluster of him sort of just went on the way out as well for some reason. And we see his face every day, right? It's money. So many things are named after him. Schools, streets, Washington, this, all, right? But again, what was he? Now, part of his mythic character, him that he wanted to see created for himself, was one that he wasn't ambitious, that he was a humble man, that he was this man who could have asserted power in ways that people would have let him, but he chose to step back and set a perfect legacy for the presidency once he is going to fulfill that role later on. But in fact, he was quite ambitious, and many letters that were discovered from him show a man that was very ambitious, very aware of his image, and he wanted to be seen in a certain way. He was a Virginia planter aristocrat. He was a man of wealth. When he was 11, I believe, he inherited several slaves and property. He was a land surveyor. He picked the jobs that he did to get him to hobnob with big landowners, and he married a woman that helped put him in a position of wealth. His background wasn't as prestigious but he was able to embed himself in with the wealthy, and he was quite ambitious in this manner. And as we talked about, he ends up possibly even accidentally triggering the French Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. And in his early days, he wasn't that great of a military man, and in fact, he kind of lied and made it look as if he knew more about the frontiers than he really did, and he made some serious blunders then. And during the war, it was not clear that he was going to be this hero that we ended up, imagining him to be. But in fact, he is going to be the guy that pulls through, and he is going to be a character that is quite popular with the public, and he's going to become legendary because of his achievements. Okay, now, also, just to mention about slaves, because slavery is going to be discussed later on more and more. George Washington is the only founding father that actually freed his slaves upon death. And during his lifetime, especially in the middle of the war, as it went on, he, as we mentioned, since he was a young boy, he owns people. He owns slaves. But he realized that it had very little moral justification. He was hearing abolitionists, a character that I'm not going to be going over as much, but one that you should always research is Lafayette, a famous Frenchman that comes and helps fight for the United States with Washington. He was against slavery. Abolitionists were coming to him. The slavery question was a topic then, and this is something that I want to kind of keep reminding us. Every time we talk about the people of the times from the beginning at this were debating the slavery issue. And he originally was opposed to letting blacks fight in the Continental Army, but he did see some fight very well, and he changed his mind and allowed free slaves to fight at certain times. And I think that by seeing them in action, realizing that George Washington realized that there were a lot of false presuppositions in regards to slavery. But when you have that kind of wealth, when you rely on that, are you going to give it up? That was something that he couldn't get himself to do. When he dies, as I mentioned, he made sure that the elderly slaves were continued to be cared for. And he made provisions. I certainly don't want to say, oh gosh, look at how great it was. I mean, he owned these people this whole time, and then it makes up for it at the end. But in fact, he really did he didn't just say, okay, you're free. He actually gave them provisions on death, and that was something that was left in his will. Okay, as we'll see later with Thomas Jefferson would not even let his slaves be free on their wills, and actually married couples were separated on slave auctions that happened to Jefferson's slaves, which we'll talk about later. So you could argue that George Washington did really take the idea of equality a little bit more seriously. But again, he was also still a soldier and an aristocrat and a man of the times. And, George Washington's false teeth, as I mentioned, weren't of wood, but in his account books, he purchased teeth from slaves, black slaves, that apparently went into some of his dentures. How they got those teeth and in what context is not known. It's a little horrifying thought. So again, it shows you the complex legacy he has in regards to this issue. Now, going back to his military side, in this war, and we will see some documentary clips talking a little bit more about this, he does make a name for himself. And later, after the revolution, it's his legacy that I think that he serves post the revolution that helps create an image of the revolution itself. He becomes like a Moses, which we'll talk about, or you know, in some way. And but then, you know, again, what it does is from the beginning, he's going to be a character that is infused with mystery and mystique, and this complicated man who at one time was in love with another man's wife and tried to get her, and she refused him, and then marries initially for wealth essentially, but then actually does have this good marriage relationship, who owns slaves but then doesn't want them, who is not always that great in the in the military, but then he does some brilliant and amazing things. His personality is much more nuanced and interesting as we break him down, but then he can no longer serve that kind of pure symbol that his legacy maintained for so long, or so maybe some people think. In any case, I kind of wanted to introduce that flavor, that various, picture, various set of pictures that we can give of George Washington going into this as well. Okay, so I'll end right here.